table as our program continues is Congressman Ron Paul of Texas. Mr. Paul, I want to start on foreign policy. It looks like from the newspapers this morning that as soon as tomorrow there will be a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives about the involvement of U.S. troops in Kosovo. Is this the proper thing for Congress to take a vote on its sense of whether or not troops should be involved?
Well, I think it should even be more than that. I think when you put troops into a military situation where there's a chance of fighting, which is certainly the case in Kosovo, that to me is an act of war. I think it should even be fully debated, and the president shouldn't dare even think about putting troops over there without explicit authority from the Congress. And we should know why we're going and what we're doing, and know what victory means, and have a whole plan. But this whole idea that the president can do it, which he intends to do it, he has not asked us for permission, he intends to do it. And he says he gets authority from NATO and United Nations, and I think it's a terrible foreign policy.
What about our responsibilities in that region? Do you think we have any?
Not a whole lot. We have a responsibility to be neutral. We don't have a responsibility to pretend that we know who the good guys are. I mean, who are they? The Kosovo Liberation Army? I hear they're not perfect. And is it Milosevic? Certainly not. But should we be going in with armed might into a sovereign nation to split it apart? I mean, Kosovo is part of Serbia. So it is a can of worms, and we're going to get in the middle of it, and we're about to. So I'm pleased that we're bringing up a resolution, because I've been harping on that for a long time, that we should at least bring it to the floor. It's not the real debate, but at least there is some debate, and yet the president has indicated that the vote is irrelevant. That he's likely to send the troops if he thinks it's important.
Let me ask you then, if in fact that scenario plays out, that there's a vote, say Congress disapproves, has a sense that they would prefer that the U.S. not be involved, then the troops are deployed, but they go with this sense of Congress hanging over the situation. What does that do to our ability to be effective?
Well, it points out that the president is not acting in a constitutional fashion. He should not send the troops, is what he should do. And if he does, over our objection, I think he's treading on shaky grounds, and he should reconsider it, and that's what I hope he'll do.
Congressman Paul will be with us for an hour and 15 minutes. Plenty of time for your conversation. We hope you'll call in this morning. We'll put the C-SPAN phone numbers on the screen. As you can see, they're divided by your political point on the spectrum, and we welcome your participation. We're going to continue looking at news stories, but you need not have one during this segment if you call in. We're just interested in what's on your mind or specific questions about what's happening in Washington. Our first call is from Canada, Saskatchewan, on the Conservative line. Good morning.
Yeah, hi, how are you this morning?
We're doing fine. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. I heard yesterday on the news that they got some Chinese guy that was kind of suspected of spying. And then about, I guess it was last week in the New York Post, there was an article that came out where Israel was caught, or they thought anyway, that Israel had been spying, or bugging, tapping the president's line, and that he had been blackmailed into cover up some spying that the Israelis were doing on the United States. And I'm just kind of curious that there has been nothing, about any hearings or any investigation into it. And I'm just kind of wondering why this is, and if Mr. Paul would have any information on if there is any spying and stuff going on by the Israelis on the Americans.
Well, we do know that Israel spies on us. The accuracy of that story, I don't know, but I assume it's true. But we've also had Pollard, who was caught spying and arrested for it. But I think that Israel's treated differently than China, obviously. And but I think your point is well taken, that there is an inconsistency. Spying against America should be spying against America and should be treated no matter who's doing it.
We're having a visit very soon from Zhu Rongji, the Chinese official, and the newspapers this morning have many different stories about China, but a number of them all connected to this allegation of spying. You've got the New York Times in front of you. Jeff Girth and Eric Schmidt have a front page story on the politics of how much of the information that's known from the reports should be revealed to the public. And another example of how it's being covered, Wall Street Journal says GOP eagerness to find security lapses under Clinton could chill ties to China. What are your thoughts about the proper relationship between our country and China?
Well, I think the proper relationship is to be as friendly and open as possible, and that we should trade with China. but we should never allow them to have our military secrets, and we should never subsidize them. We have a real problem in this country that we equate free trade with managed trade through World Trade Organizations and IMF subsidies and Export-Import Bank subsidies. So if we say we trade with somebody and we call that free trade, it's managed trade and subsidized trade. If we don't have that, then we have embargoes and sanctions, and we don't get along with people. But in the real world of real free trade, we should be friendly with people. We should talk to them if we're not fighting with them. We should allow business people to loan money, and we should allow people to sell them products. But what we should do is absolutely exclude the selling of any military technology. We're sloppy on that. When we get a private company to develop a weapon, it should be explicit in the clause of agreement, you know, in the contract, that they can't ever sell any of that to anybody. And then we wouldn't have to deal with this. There's a lot of confusion out there on what is technology and what isn't technology, but it shouldn't be confusing. You know, if the American taxpayers pay for it, and it's satellite technology or nuclear weapon technology, it shouldn't be given away. I think it should belong to America. But it's a messy situation, but I don't think closing the door on China is the right thing to do. But so often we don't have that choice. It's either subsidize them. I mean, we subsidize trade with China to the tune of $3.4 to $4 billion a year to help China. And then we close our eyes too often, like we've been for the last year or so, when the Chinese have been taking and stealing our technology. So it's the worst of situations. We subsidize the Chinese. We don't say much when they take our technology. I'm very happy that we're saying more now, and I hope we keep saying a lot about what's happened here.
Next call for Congressman Ron Paul is from Drayton Plains, Michigan, on our Liberal line. Good morning.
Good morning. In the last session of Congress, McDade Murtha in the House introduced the Citizens Protection Act. And what it did was hold the Department of Justice prosecutors to the code of conduct, code of ethics of the states that they were trying cases in. And my understanding in the Senate, there's been a bill introduced to basically gut or just completely get rid of what portions of that act did pass in the last Congress. Now, with this operation that they just ran against the President of the United States, it's quite clear that the Department of Justice is basically out of control. What's your views on this act? And I think it should be strengthened.
Well, I supported the act, and I would agree it should not be weakened. Whether or not it needs strengthened, and I haven't studied it enough. But no, federal prosecutors should not have a greater chance to abuse citizens' rights than anybody else, and they should follow the code of conduct. But there's a bigger problem here. The biggest problem is that we have too many federal laws. Under the Constitution, we'd have very, very few federal laws. Most of this would be dealt with state law and not with federal courts. And I think you would be a lot happier with eliminating a lot of abuse if we just got rid of most of the federal prosecutors. That's what we really need to do.
Niagara Falls, New York is next. Conservative line. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Oh, I meant to call on moderate.
You know, actually, you did. That was my fault. You're on the moderate line. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Sir, I respect you a lot because you're the only, or I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous right now. You're the only Republican that I really admire, and that's because you're a libertarian. Now, I've made that comment. I'd like to ask you two questions. Number one, what's your views on the war on drugs, especially legalization of marijuana? And I notice all the Republicans that are lining up for the 2000 election are seemingly allying themselves with the Christian Coalition. I'd like to know your opinion on the Christian Coalition, and do you feel they're a danger as far as an extremist viewpoint if they ever do get into power, and what can a citizen do to protect themselves from those types of extremism? I hope that made sense, sir.
Okay, good questions.
Thank you.
I disagree entirely with the federal war on drugs. I think it's a total disaster, and more than $200 billion have been spent over the last 25 years. There are more drugs than ever, more crime than ever associated with drugs. It's a law that should never be federal. The first law against marijuana was under FDR. Most conservative Republicans don't realize that, but it was FDR that introduced this notion that the federal government should police everything that we do economically and socially, and that's when the laws against marijuana occurred. I have voted for a change in the law to at least allow the states to decide whether or not marijuana can be used medicinally. So I think this is a step in the right direction, although there's not much enthusiasm here in Washington to back off on the war on drugs. Everybody hates drugs. I'm a physician. I detest the use of drugs. It's a major problem in this country, but we ought to wake up and realize when something is an absolute failure. Not only has it failed to do what it was supposed to do, it's done a great deal of harm. Just think of all the laws written on search and seizure of property, illegally throwing out the Constitution. We could go on and on the abuse that comes out of these anti-drug laws. Now, on the Christian Coalition, I don't know if everybody in the Republican Party has decided that they have to be a real close ally of the Christian Coalition. But I myself try very hard on the right occasions to align myself with the Christian Coalition, because I think in politics what you want to do is bring as many people in to agree with a principled constitutional view. Christian Coalition and other Christian conservatives are very, very much aware of why the federal government shouldn't be in education, why we should legalize home education and private education. So therefore, they can be an ally. There are times when the Christian Coalition might not be the greater defender of civil liberties in a broad sense, but in some sense they are good, and in particular with the educational issue. So I see this as an advantage, and as an individual in politics, I try to get people to be as consistent as possible, defend the Constitution, and if they defend civil liberties in one area, defend civil liberties in all areas. And I think there's been some success in this regard.
Ron Paul is a Pennsylvanian by birth, born in Pittsburgh. He graduated from Gettysburg College. He's a physician. His medical degree is from Duke University Law School, an Air Force flight surgeon. And he served in Congress in an earlier part of his life, 1976 to 1984. In 1988, he was the Libertarian Party's presidential candidate, and then he came back to Congress in 1996. His district is the 14th District of Texas, Victoria, San Marcos, and West Columbia. Next call for him is from Biloxi, Mississippi. Liberal line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I wanted to ask you a couple of things about as far as legislation toward the Constitution. One was about Kosovo. Why in the world do we keep sticking our noses in places we don't belong, is the first question. And the second question, after hearing your last caller about the drug issue, I'm a libertarian. I called on a liberal line because they don't really have anything that matches us exactly.
They need a libertarian line, don't they?
Yes, they do. And another question I wanted to ask you is what happened at Waco? We heard all during the hearings with Clinton about him obstructing justice, and he probably did to a certain extent. Being a libertarian, I don't believe it should have ever got that far. But the point I wanted to make about Waco, when you have Texas Rangers coming on TV and saying the FBI bulldozed the crime scene and in effect obstructed justice, but I never heard anybody in Congress say anything about this, I'm going to hang up and listen to the answer.
Well, I think I wasn't here at the time the hearings were going on, but I do believe some members of the Congress did talk out about the problems with investigating Waco. There were some hearings, but obviously not very satisfactory as far as I'm concerned, because I don't think we know the full story there. It certainly is a real tragedy. Again, this is a perfect example of out-of-control law enforcement from the federal level. This should have been handled at a local level, had nothing to do with the federal government and under the Constitution. So that should have never happened, would never have happened if we had constitutional government. This would have been a local law enforcement matter, and we wouldn't have had Air Force helicopters in there and poison gases and the whole thing.
You already spoke to your point of view on Kosovo and drug issues, so I'm going to move on.
Okay.
Victoria Falls, Texas, on our conservative line. Good morning. Caller, are you there?
Yes, I am.
You're on the air.
My TV down. Am I on?
You are. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm real nervous. Ron Paul is my representative, and we are so proud of him down here. And I am so excited to be on. A couple of things I'd like to ask him about. One is the Cox report. Chris Cox and can't remember the guy's first name, but his last name is Dix. Made a report about the China business, and the White House has been trying to keep it secret until this Cox committee goes out of business in April. And I would like to know, is there any way that the Congress can actually make this public, or at least make enough of it public to where the public understands what happened? And also another thing I'd like to know about is the independent counsel statute. I would like to know what his views are about that, because myself, I believe that people with as much power as the president has, we really need someone who has at least the authority to investigate him, and obviously the Justice Department is not going to do it. I'm going to hang up and listen to what he says. Thank you.
Thanks. The Cox report is the report referenced in this New York Times story. And they write, last December, a bipartisan committee unanimously approved a voluminous report concluding that China had harmed national security during the last 20 years by stealing nuclear secrets and acquiring other American technology. Since then, the committee and the White House have been quietly negotiating about how much of the report could be released.
And it is an ongoing discussion, and I keep thinking any day now we may have a vote on the House floor, which would be a secret vote in order to release this information. I'm all for it.
Would you like to see all of it?
I'd release it all. I want to know what's going on, and I think the American people deserve to know what's going on. And I just think that we have too many secrets. I don't believe the CIA should be running around the world sabotaging different regimes anyway. So if there's information like that, bring it out. Let us know. So the more the merrier. On the special counsel law, I understand her point that we have to have a way of oversight for the president, but the Constitution allows for it without a special counsel, and that has to do with the Congress. Nixon was investigated and put out of office without a special counsel. The Congress has to assume its responsibility. It can, review and oversight and check into any of these areas, and therefore I will not be a sponsor or supporter of continuing with the special counsel law, but I would be urging the Congress to do more, such as the Cox report. This is a way to find out what the administration is going. We need to do more of that.
Vienna, Virginia, next. Moderate line.
Thank you. I'm glad to see that there are more physicians in Washington these days. My comment, I've got a comment and a question. Yesterday there was a commentary in the Washington Post called The Wrong RX. It was by Sandra Feldman. And she made the comment, despite how well it works, the free market model is not a good fit for healthcare or education. My comment is, we expect healthcare to work as a free market, but we leave out two important features of what you need for a free market to work. And that's information on price, or how much the services that you're receiving are before you get them, or the products that you use are before you get them, and information on who the real high-quality providers are. There is a difference in the level of quality that's provided out there, as I'm sure you know. My question is the patient protection legislation in Congress today, the several different versions of it, just a way to maintain the independent contractor status of physicians and not really a way to bring accountability to the healthcare system? And again, I want to thank you for the opportunity, and this is a great show.
Thank you. I don't think the bills in Congress would protect the independent status of the physician. That's long gone. Oh, nor the privacy of the patient. The privacy of the patient and the choice of the patient, that's long gone. I think everything that has happened for the last 20 or 30 years has moved us in the direction of managed care, managed corporate care. We don't have socialized medicine. We sort of have corporatism or a fascist system of medicine, because patients don't have choices. There is no pricing structure. There's first a third-party payment from insurances and government. Prices go too high. Then they have to ration care and have price fixing. So we have an absolute out-of-control managed care system. It's going to get a lot worse. People are going to get a lot unhappier with medical care. And there's nothing wrong with arguing, because I strongly believe that no matter what service we provide for anybody, it's better done in the free market than through a bureaucratic, mismanaged federal government. That's what we're suffering from. So a free market can work in education as well as in medicine. If you have to have some government, the more local the better. The more big government you have and the more centralized government you have, the more abuse and the more corruption.
Providence, Rhode Island. Good morning, Liberal Line.
Hi, I'm a big fan, and it's my first-time caller. I have just two questions I'd like to ask the Honorable Congressman, and that is one, as far as the being a libertarian, how do you feel about the excesses of Ken Starr? I mean, Julie Hyatt Steele, this poor woman, I just can't believe how he has been running roughshod. And I just don't think it's right. I think a lot of people feel that way. And number two, about the Chinagate issues, I am not a big defender of Mr. Clinton, but you kind of have to be when you have the extreme right wing winding his head. And I'd just like to say that this happened in '88, that the technologies have been stolen for 20 years, and we know that different countries, all countries, including ourselves, spy on each other. Now, I'm not saying this is a good thing. I didn't think that we shouldn't have, maybe Mr. Clinton shouldn't have put it into the Commerce Department, not trade, and I wasn't a big proponent of NAFTA. Anyways, I just don't understand. I seen Dana Rohrabacher last night on TV, a fellow representative from California, Republican, and he was just a firebrand, like yelling and screaming and saying, like, Clinton's basically, it's kind of like the extreme right-wing Republicans are trying to use to say Democrats equals communism, just the way Truman, when he fired MacArthur, it's been haunting the Democratic Party for years, and I just don't think that's right. I think we should just work together and bipartisanship and try to clean up the fact that we have spies trying to endanger our national security.
Thank you, Providence.
Well, I think there's no doubt about it. It needs cleaning up, but I think the case can be made that it's a lot worse than it's been. Yes, some technology went to China prior to Clinton, but I think, again, that has to do with our confusing way we do contracts with our contractors that build our military weapons. I think that it is tremendously abused. We should find out about that. And if military technology has not been sold, but stolen, and then we find out that there's been tremendous donations made to the president during the presidential campaign, we really can't ignore that.
Livingston, Texas is next on our conservative line.
Hello.
Good morning, caller.
Good morning. I'd like to talk to Mr. Ron Paul about Social Security, a problem that I'm having. Mr. Paul, have you worked on the bill concerning the Notch babies?
Not directly, no, I have not.
You're familiar with it, though.
I am, yes.
I've just been really concerned about the unfair treatment toward the Notch victims. It seems like it's only fair that we should receive the same as all others. Now, my husband and I both are, I was born in 26, he in 24, which makes us eligible for the increase, also the $5,000, I think they call it $5,000 lump sum Notch settlement. Could you kind of talk about that a little bit and see what we can do about it?
Well, I can't talk a whole lot about it because I don't feel like I'm an expert on it, but the issue has been around a long time. There's been a lot of complaints. I have never seen any serious move here in the Congress to correct it. I do think, though, the issue of equity is something that we should pay attention to. So anything that would be equitable for everybody, I think we should go ahead and do it. But unfortunately, I can't say, oh, yeah, this is something we're on the verge of dealing with, because quite frankly, I think that there hasn't been a lot of momentum here to really bring that to the House floor.
While she brings up the issue of Social Security, have you decided your position on Social Security reform?
Yes, I've decided on that a long time ago because I've had my own ideas, but I don't know whether it would fit in completely and totally with, you know, the 2 or 3 things that are floating around on the Hill. I support strongly that the Social Security system be separate and that we not touch those funds. Therefore, the deficit, there would be no surplus. because last year the national debt went up $113 billion because we counted Social Security. So we ought to be honest with our budgeting. So I'd set all the trust funds aside, whether they're highway funds or whether it's Social Security. I would make sure that none of the income to a recipient is taxed. I would make sure that people don't have any limitations on their interns, and hopefully someday the ultimate goal would be to allow young people, if they don't think it's a good investment, to get out of the system. But we're not quite there, but at least we're on the verge of maybe setting it aside as a special trust fund, and that we not abuse it and we not doctor up the budget the way we do.
Were you in this meeting yesterday where the leadership talked about its budget plans for this session?
No, I wasn't there.
Is there a reason why you weren't there? It says it's with the House membership, the Republican membership.
I'm not quite sure why exactly.
In this, it says that they sold their membership on a budget plan, and one of the things that it would do would that limits on discretionary spending would be adhered to, and that budget surpluses generated by Social Security taxes will not be tapped for tax cuts or extra spending. And the proposal also, I believe, is to move offline the Social Security.
And that was one of the first things that Livingston had said when he was about to be Speaker, and I think that idea is a very good idea. I think it would be much more honest.
Will it be successful in this Congress?
I think if we can get past the demagoguing, you know, about this and how it's so often politicized and how the PR fight is won. But I think the momentum is in that direction.
Let me just ask you generally to describe your relationship with the rest of the Republicans in the caucus. You are a libertarian, but a representative of the Republican Party from your district. Are you generally involved in the Republican?
You know, I think more so than anybody would realize. It's really a nice position to be in, because you can work very closely with conservatives who are very libertarian on economic issues, and therefore I'm very strong with them, and they like that. But when it comes to personal liberties, when it comes to fighting the war on drug and on foreign policy, you tend to align more with the liberals. So you really, instead of a moderate giving away half the philosophy to each one and you know, trying to bring people together, you bring people together by sticking to the liberal principled views that I see as correct, and sticking to the conservative viewpoints that I see as correct, and bringing people together.
Has the leadership generally been helpful in giving you the committee assignments you seek?
I think so. I think a good example of being able to work under this system has to do with this privacy issue, the know your customer issue, which was one of the articles I had with me. But I think a lot of people know about know your customer. This was the program where the government was enforcing the banks to set up a profile on every citizen. So it was a privacy issue, and privacy is a real good issue for a libertarian, because conservatives are good on too. They finally say, hey, you know, why do we have to give our Social Security number? And again, the gentleman mentioned Christian Coalition. People in the Christian Coalition like their privacy too. They like their religious privacy. So, but liberals are good on privacy too. ACLU joined me in fighting Know Your Customer. At the same time, the Christian Coalition and Christian groups came together, and we essentially were able to defeat that by bringing it together. It's just that a libertarian can't bring liberals and conservatives together when they're compromising on spending more money. Too often, one of the criticisms I have for my own party is on education, instead of sticking to the principle saying the federal government shouldn't be involved in education. Remember, Ronald Reagan used to talk about getting rid of the Department of Education, and we talked about it in 1994. Now, conservatives too often are joining with the liberals, and they're coming up with this sort of moderate, mushy viewpoint on education. And actually what's turning out is conservatives are trying to outdo liberals on how much money is going to be spent on federalizing education. So that works in a negative sense when you try to get people together in a moderate fashion. But if you're looking at something like privacy or foreign policy, I think foreign policy now, we're getting conservatives to come together against Kosovo, but it's a natural tendency of many liberals. If it wasn't for Clinton being supporting of these troops, I mean, we'd have, you know, if Reagan was doing this, you'd have every single Democrat opposing it. But it's a good chance for a libertarian to point this out, that there's reason to defend the Constitution. There's a reason to defend neutrality and friendship and with all nations and bring them together. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I feel that much can be achieved.
Naugatuck, Connecticut. Thanks for waiting. You're on the air.
Hi, thank you. Hello?
Go ahead.
Hello.
Okay. Hi, Mr. Paul. I forgot, or not forgot, but didn't quite hear exactly what you said earlier about the marijuana issue. My question is, with just the way things are, with the way things are brought up, especially now with Mexico, with the whole drug, how they're coming in, and this and that, and it's kind of being, the marijuana gets thrown in. I like to call it cannabis. It's cannabis. It's not it's not a evil thing. Believe me. It gets thrown in with the hard drugs. Crack, cocaine, heroin, and it gives, especially people like my grandmother, this look at it like it's, how it's been looked at for so long. And I think we really need, especially now where people's eyes are opening up to the medical purposes here. It goes beyond that, and what it needs is people in higher places to address it. And for myself, I mean, I've been using it for 8 years, and I'm not very, very old, but I'm not too young, and I could say that it's unlike no other. It's safer to me than drinking. I don't go out, I don't drive on it, I don't do anything. It's something I do within the privacy of my own home. It's not, and here's the big problem: how does one get it if they want it? And that's where there's a problem with dealing going on, and you want to, I just think that there's a lot of problems with it. I think a lot of things are being suppressed about it.
Well, I don't deal with this on the relative danger of the different drugs. I mean, we have alcohol, we have tobacco, we have marijuana, we have heroin. I deal with this with the Constitution, the rule of law, and the way we're supposed to handle our problems and respect states' rights. So I don't want to put this in the category and say, well, marijuana isn't as dangerous as heroin, so therefore we ought to legalize marijuana. That's not my argument. My argument is the federal war on drugs is a total disaster, and that all things like this, I do not downplay the danger of all drugs. And one of them, the drugs that are killing the most people happen to be prescription drugs right now, and then alcohol. But the other drugs kill too. So we should never suggest that these drugs aren't dangerous. What I'm saying is that there's a greater danger in the way the federal government has tried to train people to behave. Federal government should not be in a role of making people behave better. And that is like, now it's the federal government that's teaching them that they shouldn't smoke cigarettes. Well, I detest smoking cigarettes too. But I do not think the federal government should be training our children. That should be the parents' job or local government or somebody else, but not up here with a police force. Now we have the agencies of government, including the DA. There's federal agents now. There are 80,000 of them carrying guns, policing this country. We're working our way toward a police state, and a lot of people aren't very happy with that.
Miami Lakes, Florida. Good morning. Liberal Line.
Yes, good morning. As I look on the screen there, I can see snow in the background, and here in South Florida, we're going to have an 82-degree day with lots of sunshine and a cloudless sky. So I suggest that maybe we close down Congress and C-SPAN and come on down to Florida.
Thanks. You had to do that to us, didn't you?
Anyway, my point to the congressman is regarding the United Nations and what Congress can do. Number one, I'd like to recommend that we stop being the biggest deadbeat in the world and pay our $1.3 billion UN dues that have been on the books for some time. But also, number two, and equally as important, since we were one of the founders of the United Nations, one of the original signers of the United Nations, which in effect, and the media doesn't seem to want to talk about this very much, but the UN has codified international law. And we say we're a country of laws, but we seem to ignore international law or pick and choose when we want to follow it. For example, in Desert Storm, we used the United Nations and international law to throw back Iraqi troops from Kuwait. But we're using NATO, for example, in Kosovo, threatening to bomb a sovereign nation of Yugoslavia, and under international law, again, is codified by the UN, only the Security Council can do that. But, and I could go on and on, north and south fly zones in Iraq and so forth, that let's get Congress to say, We're going to, once and for all, follow international law.
Thank you, sir.
Well, I think you sort of make my case that international law isn't very good because countries don't follow it unless they feel like it. So the fact that the United States follows it sometimes and not at other times is an indication it's not worth much. But the real reason why we shouldn't be doing this is the justification for the Persian Gulf War was a UN resolution, not the people speaking through their members of Congress. That, to me, is atrocious. It should have never happened, and we should not use the United Nations as a substitute for national sovereignty. As far as paying the past dues, there's no way I would ever vote to pay those past dues, mainly because they owe us money. We pay for all this police activity, and if you add it up, they're indebted to us. So this whole idea that we owe them money is just nonsense. So I support the idea that very little good comes out of the United Nations, and a great deal of harm is going to come, and we ought to talk seriously about getting out of it.
After that, he may not want you to come to Florida so quickly, Congressman.
Yeah, you won't invite me back.
Next is a call from Boulder, Colorado, conservative line. Good morning.
Good morning. You know, I just have to say, listening to you, in the parlance of my generation, right on. But really, I promised to talk about, you know, keeping the independent counsel, and after thinking about it a while, you know, the initial knee-jerk reaction is to get rid of it. I think maybe we ought to keep it because the notion of Janet Reno investigating Ken Starr when it should be the other way around is disconcerting. But what I was thinking about while you were talking was, you know, you were talking about education and really basically allowing the opposition to frame the predicate. In other words, not should we just get rid of the whole thing as it is now, as deleterious as it is now, and as much of a failure as it is now. That's not, you know, that is the question. The question is not what we should adjust, what little knobs we should tweak or whatever. We have a total failure for an educational system, and I think that's just an example of, I guess, a cultural war that for the hearts and minds of America. So that was just my thought. You know, just yesterday I was seeing something about teaching children in school, grade school, you know, second, third graders, self-esteem. And the statistics are now coming in, and some of these kids have less self-esteem than if they'd just been left alone. I just think that childhood is all about hope and dreams, and you don't need to teach them self-esteem. Just teach them how to live, and the rest will take care of itself. But anyway, that's my whole thing, and you're just doing a great job, and it's just nice to hear somebody who's rational.
Yeah. Well, on the education, I realize that we can't turn a switch and everything is going to be changed, so I have made the suggestion to introduce legislation that would allow every parent $3,000 tax credit per child to take it upon themselves to educate them. That does not mean they have to take them out of public school. Just use that money to educate their children, whether it's homeschooling, private schooling, or in addition to public schooling. And this would take the control out of the federal government. This idea that we can manage education from the federal level is the reason why education is in bad shape. Just very briefly, again, I want to repeat on the special counsel law. I understand the concern that we can't trust the president to investigate himself. But the Congress, if they would do a better job, they would be able to do the job as they did when they investigated Nixon.
The independent counsel investigating Henry Cisneros won a victory in federal courts yesterday. According to the Washington Post this morning, Bill Miller's story, a federal appeals court yesterday upheld an independent counsel's right to bring former Housing Secretary Henry Cisneros to trial on charges that he lied to the FBI about paying $250,000 in hush money to a former mistress. The decision was by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, who left intact all 18 charges against Cisneros. It goes on to say a three-judge panel unanimously rejected Cisneros' bids to have the charges thrown out on the grounds that the federal law prohibiting false statements to law enforcement officers does not apply to information provided during FBI background checks. For Congressman Ron Paul, we go next to Athens, Georgia. Paula, you're on the air. Welcome.
Hi. I appreciate hearing from someone like you who is a thinking politician instead of a knee-jerk politician. I appreciate that. And I would like to know how you feel about the AFL-CIO trying to unionize the Red Cross. And after you finish talking about that, I would like to know how you feel about raising the minimum wage because of all the workers in the daycare centers and the home health care centers who are making sometimes $5 and $6 an hour.
First, on the AFL-CIO, I didn't know they were trying to unionize the Red Cross. Unions in a free society have a perfect right to unionize, negotiate, organize, do whatever. I'm opposed to regulating unions from the federal level. If they have funds, they should be able to spend them like I can spend my own funds. So I don't like regulating unions, but there should be no compulsion. They should gain no authority from the federal government. They can't force themselves on anybody. So if the American Red Cross says, you know, we don't want to negotiate with unions, they should have that right. All contracts should be voluntary, just as they are between individuals in a social sense. Most people recognize that can be voluntary. So I would say that this should be permitted, but they should have no authority. Same way with the minimum wage law. We can deal with that on contractual basis and voluntarism. That is that government should have nothing to say about the payment of a person you hire. And the economic argument is very strong. It usually hurts the very people you're trying to help. But minimum wages, the authority for establishing a minimum wage is the same authority that eventually, if you have high inflation, is that you freeze wages. So in a free society, you don't use force and intimidation to bring about changes that you think might be beneficial.
Baltimore, Liberal Line, good morning.
Good morning, Congressman. I know you're not a particular fan of government regulation, but I did have a question for you about the tracking system that's supposedly being built into the new Pentium processors that are shipping, I think, this month. Apparently there's some sort of code built into them that can be detected by let's say, commerce sites that you visit. And ideally, that would be used to ensure the security of your transactions, but a lot of people have concerns that it's going to be used to track your movements.
Did it was it put into the Pentium chip by choice, or was it done because government told them they had to?
I think Intel put it in because they decided to, but the furor is that you can't really turn it off. And while there are a few alternatives to the Intel processor, it's sort of built into a lot of machines. Yeah. And I don't know that too many people have the savvy to deal with disabling it properly.
Right. Now, if they did it as a response from pressure from government, that would be very bad. But if it's in there because they decided to do it, the consumer has an obligation to know something about it. So, but I think that the computer system and government coercion is a very dangerous thing. Government now is prohibiting the ability to scramble your messages and to develop privacy. So there is a bill in Congress to try to allow this technology to be developed and to be sold. And I think that is very important, that the market sorts this out, that not only can you maintain your privacy, you should not have to react to government's demand that for law enforcement purposes you have to do this because someday we might be able to find a criminal on the internet or something like that.
Our next call of the morning comes from Chesapeake, Virginia, on the conservative line. Good morning.
Good morning. Hello, Mr. Ron Paul.
Morning.
Glad to get a hold of you. I've contributed to your campaign whenever possible. I believe that you're going to be one of the few people able to understand me. I believe our nation has forgotten the roots of our nation. We started out with a different government called the Articles of Confederation. It was a very weak central government, and it was set up that way because the founders discovered that throughout history, governments have been the source of the greatest evil. We absolutely must go back to a limited government, and if that requires changing the Commerce Clause to read deregulate commerce between the states, then I think we have to do that. I don't know how likely that is in my lifetime, though.
Not likely, but if we interpreted the Commerce Clause as it was originally intended and as it was interpreted through the 19th century, it would be used for deregulation. That was the purpose, to break down the barriers. It was to make it a common market and have a common currency. But since I think it was about 1895 that court rules and the movement toward centralized government has been such
that they use the Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate just about everything and anything. It certainly needs clarification or reasserting of the original Constitution.
On politics, once again, has Jesse Ventura's success changed the prospect for third-party candidates in this country?
I hope so, but I'm not so sure, because I think most independent thinking people who would like to see more participation in the electoral process were delighted, with Jesse Ventura. The big problem is all the rules and the laws are biased against anybody who doesn't conform. You either have to be in the Republican or Democratic Party, or you can't get very far because there's too many obstacles. Unless you're independently wealthy like a Ross Perot, he did better than the average libertarian might do, because libertarians don't have money, the third parties don't have money. Now, Jesse Ventura did not have to spend a lot of money, which was great, but he also had celebrity status. So, if you limit politics to celebrity status and a lot of money, and then come in with the worst thing to do to competition is to allow the major parties, which you're getting ready to do, write the laws and say, well, there's going to be a limitation on the money and the government's going to distribute the money. Matter of fact, that's about the only thing I strongly disagree with Jesse Ventura on. He says, you shouldn't have, you should have the government passing out the money. But that would be horrible. What you need is open up the competition, let people spend the money they want, and not put these obstacles like signature gathering that you have to get on the ballot. What you want is competition. You don't want to deliver it narrowly to the rich people. Or just think if we had this very limited amount of money given out by the government to run a campaign. Third-party people might not get it, and then all of a sudden you would deliver this tremendous power to the media. Maybe what's reported in the newspaper, if I couldn't answer back what the newspaper said, I'd be handicapped. So all of a sudden, the media would have more control over our elections. But in general, I think he has done a lot of good. I mean, I think a lot of people are cheering him on.
Quick question related. USA Today has its lead story today that the presidential fund that we can check off on our taxes is running low of contributions. It says here that they project that the fund will provide for only 40% or less of the eligible funds that candidates competing for their party's nomination will be entitled to receive in January of 2000. Is this fund one of those things that gets in the way of people getting into the system?
I think the fund is almost irrelevant. I mean, it's been able to match up because they get enough checkoffs to do it, but it's really just a slush fund in the general revenue fund. I think if they want to continue funding this, they'll just take it from someplace else. But I just think but that's good that it's going down. It just means that more people are getting disenchanted with this system. Most people aren't voting, and that's what was great about Jesse Ventura. They had almost twice as many people come out. We need more competition, and we need more ideas out there to excite people. But as long as it's wishy-washy stuff, people get disenchanted, and obviously they're getting disenchanted. They're not checking off the money. But I'm not too worried, and people who like that system shouldn't worry too much, because they'll find the money someplace. All of a sudden, the Republican and Democrat at their national conventions aren't going to be shortchanged. They'll have the money. I can assure them.
Linden, New Jersey is next for Ron Paul. Good morning.
Good morning, Congressman. I think you're doing a fantastic job. My question is about Kosovo. In Somalia, when our Rangers were sent in there, 18 died when they begged their UN commander for more ammunition, and it was denied. I was just wondering if our troops will be going to Kosovo under any kind of foreign command. And also a question, aside from the fact that the president is violating the Constitution because only Congress can declare war, and this to me is an act of war, isn't he also violating the Wars Power Act?
Yes, you're right. It's violating the Constitution. You're right. These troops are going to be put under foreign command. That's unconstitutional. This means that if he goes into war, he has assumed that our agreement with NATO was a more important document than the Constitution that says Congress should declare war. So I think all that is true.
Next is West Springfield, Massachusetts, Liberal Line.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
I can see this is a very popular program because it took me so long to get on.
Well, thanks for your persistence. What's on your mind?
A couple of questions, Congressman. I have to agree with you when you mentioned that all the trust funds should be put aside and have it as a trust fund.
Right.
I agree on that. But when you're looking for a 10% tax cut across the board, who's going to that's going to create a bigger deficit. Who's paying for the tax cut?
Well, nobody ever pays for the tax cut. You never should talk about paying for a tax cut. Nobody pays for it. When you get a tax cut, all we're doing is allowing you to keep more of what is yours, and you have a right to. So this means we have to cut some spending. Why have we spent these $20 billion in Kosovo? I mean, that's not our obligation to police the world. So you could say, and what are we going to do? We're going to expand it. We're going to spend billions. I'm sorry, in Bosnia we've spent the 20. We're going into Kosovo. We're bombing on a daily basis in the Persian Gulf. We're not achieving anything. We're solidifying the enemy, and we're hurting a lot of innocent people. So we endlessly spend these monies. We spend, $27 billion in foreign aid last year. I would say you deserve a tax cut a lot more than the Chinese deserve foreign aid from us. And that's what we should do. We should cut the spending, give the tax cut, set aside the Social Security. It's not nearly as complicated as they'd like to make it make you think.
Another story on the budget this morning is from the Washington Post. George Hager writes it, and here's the headline: GOP budget plan and the spending caps to collide, panel chairman warned. When were the spending caps put in place?
I guess that was, in 90, 94, 95, but in the budget resolution. But the spending caps aren't, this goes back to my previous answer. The spending caps aren't going to be honored. They're going to go over. There's no move in the Congress to cut spending. There's only one move in the Congress, that is to spend, because they've talked themselves into believing there's a lot of surpluses which don't exist. So the spending cuts aren't going to occur, and the caps are going to be blown, and the economy is going to turn down, and the revenues are going to go down, and we're going to have an entirely different picture in about 2 years from now. Absolutely different than what it is now. Before it was that the deficits that we're going to run to eternity, now the surpluses are going to run to eternity. That means the economists, and especially the government economists, really don't know what they're talking about, and they haven't been very good in projections. So this idea that they're going to have endless amounts of money and deciding, well, how are we going to spend it on tax cuts, and we're going to continue our foreign intervention, we're going to continue the foreign aid, and we're going to expand educational programs, that's all going to reality is going to set in, and the deficits are going to go back up. There will be a recession.
Columbus, Ohio, you're next. Good morning.
Hey, Congressman Paul.
Morning.
I just wanted to make a comment and ask you a question here. The first thing, an earlier caller was defending Julie Hyde Steele, and I would just remind people that there are two other people besides Kathleen Willey who claim that at that, years ago, she indeed told them the Kathleen Willey story. And if that's true, then she's a perjurer. And then the question I had for you is, as a libertarian, how do we strike the right balance between regulation and not having the government interfere? For example, say, take the chemical industry. Someone who pollutes may save a lot of money, right, yet they could cause people to have cancer.
Right. No, that's a good question, because a libertarian has to be able to answer that, and we have to answer it in the context of the Constitution. In a free market, moral society, nobody has the right to injure their neighbor. So therefore, the chemical plants cannot dump pollution into the rivers, and they can't dump it into your air. It should be illegal. But during the Industrial Revolution, there was a collusion between big business and government that prevented that. Anybody who complained didn't get very far because it was necessary to promote the Industrial Revolution. But you don't need the federal government to do this unless under very, very rare circumstances. But states should handle this. It should be handled the same way as you and your neighbor handle your property. I mean, when you get a garbage can full of garbage, you're not allowed to go to the fence and just dump it over. You'd be arrested immediately. So if the chemical company or city sewage plants or anybody else pollutes, they should be stopped. But it should be stopped not by federal regulations, but by the protection and the honoring of property rights. And the courts should honor this. Too often, 100 years ago, the courts did not honor the property rights like they should.
Next call is from Cincinnati.
Mr. Paul.
Hello.
Hello. Got a question. You talk about the rights of privacy and the Banking Acts and everything, and people have a private capacity, and then they have a public capacity with their Social Security number through the Commerce Clause. How would you define the Constitution that would allow people to protect their private capacity?
Well, the Constitution, I think, is very clear that we as individuals should be protected. It honors the principle of private property, and it's explicit that government can't intrude in our houses. So I think it's very clear, but I think we drifted from it. You know, even in 1935, under Social Security, when they brought this in, they were very reassuring to the American people. This Social Security card and Social Security number would never be used as an identifier. And yet that is what it's being used. Even up until 1961, we didn't even put our Social Security number on our tax returns. So I don't think it's too difficult. They just shouldn't have that authority to pry into our privacy. And they shouldn't be allowed to have a universal identifier. They shouldn't be able to have a national ID card. They shouldn't be allowed to set up this national medical data bank, which they're planning to do. And they certainly should never have said to the banks that you will monitor every single, not cash transaction, but every check transaction, every deposit. And if you vary from it, you will be reported to the FDIC and the DEA and the FBI and the Federal Reserve to find out maybe you committed a crime. In other words, you're guilty. Prove yourself innocent. So, no, there's a way you can separate this, and I think it's difficult, though, if you're a strong endorser of big government, because big government needs to monitor what the people are doing. And a lot of conservatives too often will say, well, this program isn't so good, and I'm not for it, but we better make sure there's no waste and fraud, so they try to clean up the waste and fraud, and therefore that invites them to say, well, we better know exactly what everybody is doing, and this will prevent it. Well, the basic problem there is the government is doing way too much or involved in programs they shouldn't be involved in.
We have about 15 more minutes in our conversation with Mr. Paul. You were reading the morning newspapers this morning. I think we got to a number of your topics. Why don't you look and see if there's some others? I'm going to listen to a call on the internet.
Okay, go ahead.
Westerville, Ohio, Liberal Line.
Yes,
Good morning.
Mr. Paul. I have been a dyed-in-the-wool Republican for about 30 years, and in the last 4 years I have become so disgusted with the Republican Party not owning up to what I would call principles. Here you have Dennis Hastert, who is the leader of the party now as Speaker of the House, slipping in a $250,000 taxpayer grant for the study of caffeinated gum, which, as I see it, definitely supports the Stay Alert Caffeinated Gum Company in his home district. Now, if he is the leader of the party setting that kind of example, what kind of hope is there for the Republican Party to do anything in regards to trimming down government and lowering taxes?
Let me ask you a question, sir. How did you find out the information about that?
Through the Cato Institute.
So are you online with them, or do they send you documents?
I'm a sponsor of the Cato, and I got that through some of their documents.
Is it an article they wrote, or do you actually sit and spend some time looking at budgets, federal budgets, to look for programs like this?
I believe it was an article written by Edward Crane, the president of the Cato Institute. Okay. And also, when you look at their handbook for Congress, you find a lot of information in there.
All right, thanks.
Good. That's good information, and I think you raise an important point on whether or not we do have hope. I guess I wouldn't be here if we didn't have some hope, because if we can't run for office and we can't come to Congress and do things, then there is no hope, and I should do something else for a living and go back to medicine. But I understand why people would be discouraged, but I can compare being in Congress in the 1970s to the 1990s. And I really believe that after 1994 there would be more hope and more enthusiasm, and there is. I can do more now with the Republicans in charge than I could before. But if you try to say, and if you try to get me to argue that things are rosy and we're really moving rapidly toward a free society, then I have to be hesitant.
Did you find this?
Yes. This was a very brief mention in the New York Times, a very small article, and also a very small mention in the Wall Street Journal, but I consider it very important. And it has to do with Qatar. Qatar was meeting, I think, with one of the ambassadors was meeting with Bill Cohen, and they really came out strongly. They're one of our allies in the Persian Gulf War, and they're over in that area, but they've strongly come out and they have criticized us bombing, this continuous bombing of Iraq. So I think it's something that the American people have to be alert to, and the Congress, is that this ongoing war, you know, we've been bombing and essentially occupying Iraq for a longer period of time than we did Japan after World War II. So this to me is something that even our close allies in the regions who have the most at stake are getting tired of us endlessly bombing Iraq, killing a lot of innocent people, embargoing, taking away food and medicine from children, at the same time believing that this is actually getting rid of Saddam Hussein. It actually strengthens Saddam Hussein. I would like to bring this to our attention, mainly to suggest that maybe we ought to rethink our foreign policy in that area.
Next call is from Huntsville, Tennessee, conservative line.
Hello.
Hello.
Glad to get to speak on C-SPAN.
Well, we're glad to have you. What's on your mind?
Well, you know, we've all hollered about government being too big, government doing too much, government not doing enough. You know, we've got a republic for which it stands, and the people really don't have any input in it too much, except we get chosen or elected officials from the start. And you mentioned it a while ago that people outside don't have much of a chance to get in, especially if they just got a good idea and ain't got no money, it don't go nowhere. And what I'm trying to say is, why don't we bust up Washington, D.C.? They're all the time trying to get 2 senators and congressmen elected out of the D.C. area. Why don't we send the agriculture department maybe to Tennessee, which I'm from Tennessee, but we send the other department heads to all the 50 states, and that way, with all the communications that we have in this country today, and it's going to get bigger every year, all it takes is a phone call from the satellite back to Washington, D.C., or to Tennessee, or to Wyoming, or wherever, to Texas, wherever you're from, and we could bust up all that stuff, and it would cost less to do it, because all the people that likes to go to Washington and buy their way into the government to do their thing for themselves, then that would limit all that, and it would cost less to operate the government, and we could get a tax break, you know.
Huntsville, thanks.
Okay.
Let me let you go at that point.
I think it's a good idea, but I would just return this function to the state because the state had the proper responsibility to take care of all these. I wouldn't maintain the big federal bureaucracies and just split them up. I would send all the responsibility back to the states.
Lake Havasu City, Arizona is next.
Good morning, Susan.
Good morning.
Thank you. I have a question for Representative Paul, but first I'd like to tell you that down here in Arizona, we got a lot of things to be thankful for. One of them is C-SPAN that starts our day every morning for 2 hours. The other one is that we're 2,000 miles from Washington, and we thank goodness for that. And we're across the river from California because we don't want to be over there. Okay, so with all that, Representative Paul, I wonder why there are so few people like you who will stand up and say the things you said about the United Nations a while ago. In Washington, and I've spent quite a bit of time there years ago, I don't hear anybody saying that, but it's absolutely true. When did we get appointed to be the protector of the world? I was an infantry officer in World War II, and I had to go back and do it again in Korea. And ever since then, I've been amazed that every time something happens in the world, we've got to send troops to help somebody. It wasn't very successful in Southeast Asia. It will never be successful where we are now. Kosovo, a place where there's been fighting for 1,000 years, and there will be again after we leave or while we're there, even worse. So I congratulate you, but why don't we hear more of what you just said in Washington?
Well, you would hear more if more people put more pressure on their congressmen. The congressmen are pretty good at sensing what is politically expedient. So if enough people spoke out and called their congressman and said, support my bill to get out of the United Nations, they would respond. But so it's not only the Congress's fault, it's the people's fault too. They need to participate and put more pressure on their congressmen.
Kirksville, Missouri next. Moderate line.
I have a question for Mr. Paul about Social Security. Does he think there ought to be a floor, not a floor to Social Security?
I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Well, you said that they ought to be able to pay, the employer should be able to pay what he wants. Nobody should be able to tell him what...
Oh, no, we were talking about the minimum wage law then. What I was saying on Social Security is that you should not have to pay taxes on what you receive, and there should be no limit on what you can earn outside. So if you want a part-time job on their Social Security, you wouldn't lose any of what is entitled to you.
And what do you feel about means testing?
Which one? Means testing? Not under Social Security because, theoretically, you're getting back the money that you were supposed to put in, and if it had been kept there, we could honor that commitment. But I wouldn't get into the means testing.
Warren, Michigan, you're next for Ron Paul. Conservative line. Good morning, caller.
Hi. I'd like to ask Congressman Paul his views on the practice that's widespread in this country now of state governments condemning the property of private individuals in order to build large sports arenas for private companies who own sports teams.
Well, again, I think that's a violation of property rights. There should be very, very few reasons why any government should be able to condemn property and take property. Too often, business interests are able to use the arm of government, sometimes federal and sometimes local, to bring about some of their economic projects. So I think that should be guarded. If it's done at the state level, it should be dealt with the local politicians.
In an effort to understand your political philosophy, I'd like to get your comments on where legislation and regulation like this fits into your view. Gore plans to unveil new regulations today as a part of an airline passenger rights package. Should the federal government give us guaranteed rights when we fly on airplanes?
No, there's no such thing as passenger rights or there's only individual rights. So every individual should be protected equally. No, that's meddling. But in the same sense, the other side of the coin is that airlines have no right to abuse any individual. And if they mislead or lie or defraud or injure, that individual has the right to go to their state government, state courts, and appeal and sue or whatever. But we don't assume, from our viewpoint or the Constitution, that we all of a sudden should perceive this perfect society and that we're going to regulate and everybody's molding this economic utopia. But the same person that might suggest that never comes in and say, well, sexual behavior sometimes leads to disease and sometimes it spreads AIDS. So therefore, what we need to do to cut down on the cost of government, because government pays for all this AIDS problem, what we have to do is strictly regulate sexual behavior. They never say that. But to us as libertarians, we see that once they get meddling into economic things, they commit the same error. As a libertarian free market constitutionalist, I would say you treat social interpersonal relationships the same way you treat economic relationships.
Next is Palm Desert, California, on our moderate line.
Good morning, Mr. Paul.
Good morning.
Been following you for years. Love you. You're definitely shooting straight arrows, brother. And I got one thing to say, and I've been running into this quite a bit locally, and that is private use of Social Security numbers, or I should say corporate use of Social Security numbers of individuals, like trying to sign up at a cable company or the gas company. They're all asking for it. They all require it. And if you don't give it to them, they do not give you the service. I called my Congressman Bono's office. They followed up with the FCC. Basically, they told me that they have no statutory authority to stop them from doing it, that they have a right to do it and, to deny me the service if I don't want to do it.
Yeah. That's not an easy one because I'm not anxious to interfere and tell the corporations what they can or cannot do. But the real problem there originated from the fact that who created the value in the Social Security number? It was the government. So we've created a system that now is beneficial to corporations that even if they want to use it voluntarily is an intrusion in your privacy. So that is not easily handled. Hopefully that we can find corporations that will be a lot less intrusive than others.
Dayton, Ohio, Liberal line.
Yeah, hello. How you doing, Ron Paul?
Hi.
I'm glad to see you out speaking some truth to some of the falsehoods that are being portrayed out in the media and about the government. My question is this. Since there's a lot of talk about supposedly this budget surplus that's supposedly taking place in the years on down the road as far as things have been calculated, my question is how can there be a surplus when the Federal Reserve, which is a private group of bankers who runs the money and coins the money and issues the money, how can there be a surplus when we're still borrowing money from the Federal Reserve and Congress don't have the power or authority to coin and issue money? And according to the Constitution, Congress gave up that power back in 1913 through the Federal Reserve Act. My question is, how can we ever get a surplus when we still borrow money, and when we borrow money from the Federal Reserve, then there's interest rates on the money, and that seems to never go away. And the only way to get a hold of the budget is to take back the power of printing and coining money and give it back to the Congress.
Well, you could have a surplus if you quit the spending, so theoretically you can, but they are related, as you suggest, because it gives the Congress the incentive to spend, because they do know that, oh, you know, if the interest rates go up and there's not enough people buying our bonds, you're right. The Federal Reserve comes in and they buy those bonds. They create the money and the credit out of thin air. So that is the inflation, and they're doing this massively. Since Greenspan announced 2 years ago that we had irrational exuberance in the stock market, he's created, as measured by M3, $1 trillion of new money. So it is a great concern. But I would be cautious in accepting everything that you said. The authority needs to be returned to the Congress, but under the Constitution, money can't be created either by the Congress. Congress can't print the money either. The money has to be coined. It should be backed by something of real value, such as silver and gold. But we should not allow just the printing of money. But today's situation is that the deficits are an encouragement to the Congress and for the Federal Reserve to monetize it or print the money.
Last call for Ron Pauls from McLean, Virginia.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Paul, agree with your aim for cutting taxes and reducing wasteful government spending. But I want to comment this morning on your American Restoration of Sovereignty Act, for which you asked me some contributions, which I gave, but along with a comment to the effect that, and notations to the effect that it should be the United States Sovereignty Restoration Act, because the term American is generic and it belongs to Brazil and Argentina just as much as it does to the United States. So I made some editorial changes in the act and sent it back to you. But I just yesterday got another request for support for that, and I still want to have you reword it so that it belongs to the United States.
I think your point is well taken, and we do get a lot of mail, and I might not just paid enough attention to that, but believe me, I'll pay attention to it now. But thank you for the call.
Well, in addition to wanting to fix the title, what's it do?
Oh, that's the one that gets us out of the United Nations, and you know that point we were making about war. We should not go to war because the UN directs us. We should only go to war because it's our money and our kids, with the direction of the people through a vote in the House and the Senate. And that is very important to a lot of people.
What will make this session of Congress a success for you? What's your major goal?
Well, I think if there's a lot more interest in this very subject about war powers, I consider this a very, very key constitutional issue. Taking away or stepping out and saying the president should not have the power to wage war. If we just have a full discussion of it and move a step away from it, I think that would be a major achievement. I think we've already taken a significant step in emphasizing the importance of privacy, especially with this Know Your Customer. Last year we dealt with medical savings account, medical database.